So this morning, I want to talk about a practice from a little different perspective. I want to talk about the practice of continual forgiveness. And, we talk about forgiveness here periodically. It's really a cornerstone of our spiritual path. And it's also something that transcends cultural, religious, and personal boundaries. I mean, it shows up all over the place and has for millennia. But in Buddhism, it's not just an act of absolution as it is in some other traditions. It's an essential form of inner freedom, inner liberation that frees us from things like resentment, anger, hatred. So forgiveness in Buddhism is really about another path to freedom, a freedom from those chains of resentment, anger, and hatred. So I want to talk about it this morning as a continual process, as an ongoing process, rather than a one-time event. And this idea of continual forgiveness, it really reflects the Buddhist understanding of impermanence. And it really reflects the Buddhist understanding of interconnectedness, that we're all interconnected. And it's a journey toward inner peace. It's a tool for fostering compassion in an often turbulent and ego-driven world. And as we talked about in the past on this subject, to forgive is not to condone wrongdoing. It's not to overlook the harm that might have been inflicted upon us. It's not to let someone off the hook who has hurt us. It's a way of disentangling ourselves from the cycle of suffering. And in this way, it's very consistent with our path. When we cling to anger or resentment, we perpetuate our own pain. We feed the flames of attachment to ill will. We feed the flames of attachment to anger, hatred, resentment, and so forth. So forgiveness is not just a gift that we give to others, and we may not even tell them, they may not even know, but it's primarily for ourselves. By letting go of anger, by letting go of resentment, by letting go of hatred, we allow our hearts to return to a state of balance and equanimity. Because anger and hatred and resentment moves us away from balance. It moves us away from equanimity. The Buddha spoke of forgiveness not as a passive act, but rather as an active process that requires effort. It requires mindfulness. In the Dhammapada, which is a small little book of Buddhist quotes, in verse 5, he says, quote, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is law eternal. Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal," close quotes. So continual forgiveness is a practice of breaking the cycle of hatred by responding with compassionate and understanding, even when it feels difficult or undeserved. And continual forgiveness recognizes the reality that forgiveness is never instantaneous. We don't just toss it off and be done with it. Human relationships, as you know, and human emotions are complex. The wounds inflicted upon us that we experience or perceive to be wounds by others, whether intentional or inadvertent and unintentional, can and do run deep. When we practice continual forgiveness, we acknowledge that healing takes time. It's not a one-off. We commit to revisiting the practice of forgiveness as often as necessary, which means whenever those negative feelings re-arise. When we practice continual forgiveness, we acknowledge that healing takes time, and we commit to revisiting the practice of forgiveness as often as necessary. And this aligns with the Buddhist practice of both mindfulness and the cultivation of patience. Continual forgiveness requires patience. There's not a quick fix. I don't just forgive you and then I'm done with it and I move on. That's pretty rare. Just as we gently return our attention to the breath when we're meditating, whenever the mind wanders, we return to forgiveness whenever resentment arises. Because forgiving once is not enough. We must forgive again and again. And the deeper the wound, the more we have to return. Each and every time our anger or our bitterness resurfaces. And remember, this is for our own peace of mind primarily. But it also requires humility and self-awareness. If we want to sort of take the moral high ground and think, well, wave our wounds like, a badge of honor, that's not going to help. It requires the humility of recognizing that we're all hurt and we hurt others. It forces us to confront the ego's tendency to cling to that sense of self-righteousness, to cling to that sense of victimhood. I mean, sometimes that sense of victimhood feels like a moral victory, but that's the ego getting involved. Central to continual forgiveness is the development of compassion. Remember, in Buddhism, compassion is the heartfelt wish for all beings to be free from suffering. And when we view those who have harmed us through the lens of compassion, we can perhaps see their actions not as personal attacks, but rather as expressions of their own suffering, their own ignorance, their own inability to move along on some sort of spiritual path. And when we see it as a result of their own suffering, we talked about this a little bit the other day, it helps soften our hearts and it helps us extend that forgiveness more freely. The practice of metta, loving kindness, is a powerful tool in cultivating this compassionate mindset. Because as you recall, when we do loving kindness practice, we send thoughts of goodwill to ourselves, to our loved ones, to neutral parties, and perhaps most importantly, even to those who have harmed us. We extend loving kindness. That is supportive of this practice of continual forgiveness. By doing that, we can gradually dissolve those barriers of anger and separateness. Continual forgiveness becomes easier when we recognize and accept that all beings, ourselves included, are imperfect and prone to making mistakes. That expression, hurt people hurt people. That's when we begin to move into some awareness that people that hurt us and hurt others are suffering. Forgiveness is not about forgetting the harm that was done or even reconciling necessarily with those who have wronged us. I mean, often reconciliation is not even an option. It's not a possibility. The person may have moved on. They may have died. They may be unable to engage with us on that level. We can't hold out for the possibility that forgiveness requires reconciliation because it's not always an option. But it is, in fact, about letting go of the mental and emotional burdens that we carry that keep us tethered to the past, to our past hurts and resentments. The Buddha taught, I love this in one of my favorite metaphors, that holding on to our anger is like gripping a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at the other person, only in the end being burned ourselves. It's, to me, the perfect metaphor for this concept of continual forgiveness. We grip that anger like a hot coal, thinking I'm going to throw it to you, but it burns me. Continual forgiveness allows us to drop the coal. And each time, and again, whenever we are tempted to pick it back up, which our wounded ego constantly and desperately wants to do. It wants to keep grabbing for that anger. This is a practice of non-attachment, of letting go, of relinquishing our hold on the idea that we somehow are separate from those who hurt us, that they're somehow, not suffering themselves. When we forgive, we dissolve this illusion of duality, of me versus you, and remember that all beings are interconnected, sharing in the same web of existence. Now, let me be clear. Continual forgiveness is not without challenges. I do not mean to suggest this is an easy process. It requires humility. It requires vulnerability. It requires courage and a willingness to confront our own pain. But the ego's going to resist. it's going to cling to the notion that forgiveness is a sign of weakness. Forgiveness is an admission of defeat. Forgiveness is an admission that you won somehow. But I would argue that the rewards of forgiveness far outweigh these difficulties and these challenges. And the beauty of this is through forgiveness, we experience the lightness of an unburdened heart. We let go of carrying that stuff around. The clarity of a mind free from anger. When anger gets a hold of us, we tend to ruminate about it, chew on it, repeat it, suffer with it, just dwell in it. It's just a heavy burden. Forgiveness gives us the joy of living in harmony with others, in harmony with ourselves. And continual forgiveness deepens our spiritual practice. It helps us embody the Buddha's teachings on compassion, on mindfulness, and most importantly, on the cessation of suffering. The other thing I love about this practice is when we forgive others, we learn better to forgive ourselves for our own shortcomings. Forgiveness becomes sort of the water we start to swim in. We create a cycle of healing, a cycle of growth that extends beyond ourselves to those around us. It is a profound and transformative practice. And in a mind that is consumed with anger and resentments is not a mind at peace. We cannot be at peace when we're consumed with this stuff. But it does require effort. It requires courage, patience, and compassion. But in the end, it is a journey of liberation from the bonds of anger, from the bonds of resentment. And it's a way of living that aligns with the Buddhist path to reduce suffering. By forgiving again and again, we free ourselves from suffering and we create space in our hearts for love, understanding, and peace. Because in a world filled with conflict, filled with division, the practice of continual forgiveness is a radical act of kindness and wisdom. It is that dramatic. It is a radical act of kindness and forgiveness. And as we walk this path, we remember the Buddha's words. He said, quote, "And those who harbor enmity, sorry, that word always trips me up, hatred never ceases. And those who do not harbor enmity, hatred ceases." So in other words, when we carry this stuff around, hatred never ceases. And when we don't carry it around, hatred ceases. Through forgiveness, we find freedom. So may we offer that same freedom to others again and again, to ourselves again and again, like, as the Buddha said, an endless flowing river of compassion. So that is continual forgiveness.